Hi, everybody. Tonight, in a battle as old as the internet, we'll pit two HTML elements against each other in a crusade of better and worse, right and possibly wrong. One element is triggered with the spacebar, the other the enter key. Who will win in this all-out free-for-all between links versus buttons? It's the Links versus Buttons Showdown. I'm your hostess, Marcy Sutton. So what qualifies me to be a referee today? Well, I did MC a conference once wearing a Mexican wrestler mask. That's me with Rebecca Murphy at Cascadia JS. But seriously, I am in the business of helping developers create more accessible user interfaces. I am a product owner and an engineer for AxeCore, which is a free open source JavaScript library that you can pull into your projects. It's available on NPM and on GitHub. You can also use our free Axe, Chrome, and Firefox extensions to diagnose accessibility issues in your visible markup. I like Axe because it can help you catch the low-hanging accessibility bugs that we might overlook every day, like spelling an attribute wrong, or maybe we misused an element. So I highly recommend checking that out. So what brought me here to talk about this time-old battle between links and buttons? Well, as a consultant, I've been tasked with auditing accessibility code bases, or auditing in code bases for accessibility to figure out, for a given scenario, which element is more accessible. And at one point, I audited the code base of a really large education company. It was an Angular app, and I came across a snippet that looked just like this. It was an anchor with an href with a hash symbol, tab index of 0, and an ng click, because this was an Angular app. Now, when I looked at this, they asked me, should that be a link or a button? I'll ask you, does that look like a link or a button? Which one should it be? Well, before we answer that question, you obviously need more information, right? It's kind of hard to tell just by looking at this one code snippet. So before we answer this question, we're going to look closer at these two fierce competitors, the link and the button. Here's a basic anchor link, the most basic one that it makes me wish that our toolchain was simpler, like it used to be, where your anchors are linking to an HTML resource. Now, if I had a page on wrestling on my own website, it would definitely include the video for the most illegal move in the history of wrestling. It's this kind of fish move, and then they start breakdancing after that, and that's definitely more my speed. So that would be on my wrestling page. But anchor links are the backbone of the World Wide Web. They allowed us to link documents together for the first time and create a global network of content and web applications. Tim Berners-Lee would agree that links are a fundamental part of the web platform. So why am I having to reel this all the way back to the basics? Like, we know this, right? Well, it turns out, sometimes with JavaScript apps, because you can code things up using JavaScript, you might be kind of sidestepping these basics. So I want to talk about these features so that we can get back to this idea of the web platform and linking these resources together. So what are some characteristics of links, this most basic fundamental element of the internet? Well, they navigate to pages, and they navigate to fragments of pages. So if you have an href attribute, you can either send it off to another page or another domain entirely. You could put a fragment where that fragment identifier will match an ID of an element on the page and actually jump you there, so you can use them for internal links as well as remote links. By default, anchor links cause, if they're not fragments, they will cause a browser refresh. And you might end up using a prevent default in JavaScript to prevent this behavior. That might be something more in line with a deep linked client rendered application, where you're using JavaScript to actually bring up different parts of your application. You can open things in new windows using the target attribute. And if you have been coding for very long, I think I started in '98 maybe, and frame sets were kind of on their way out. So links historically have had more uses than we actually make use of now. But the target is still pretty useful. I use it to open things in new windows. In a link, you can control click on it and open it in a new tab or a new window, which is a powerful feature that if you don't use a link, you can't make use of it. And then most importantly, for a link, it's a big accessibility feature to be able to reach a link with the tab key, and then to activate it, you use the enter key. So that's how you would use this if you were relying on a keyboard or a screen reader. And then you can also, if you hover or focus onto a link, you can show its URL in the status bar. So that's a nice thing for a user to be able to see where a link is going to go before you actually go there. That motto of "don't make me think" was a big pivotal thing for me in my career. So how do you get the most out of your links? Well, the most basic, obviously, you can just link to an HTML resource. There's this other variety that you might see in the wild of an anchor link with a tab index of 0 and an on click. Now, if you see this, the hair on the back of your neck should stand up because this is a code smell. This is an anti-pattern. So the problem with this is that there's no href anymore. We're using tab index to make it focusable and then relying on a JavaScript click event. So we're really not using this element to its full potential. It is perfectly legitimate that you might use JavaScript to layer on top of this href behavior. So this third variation has an href. It has a route that is indicative of a client-rendered application. And then it has this on-click, which is perfectly fine, given that you have this foundation of links in your application. In terms of screen reader support and accessibility, you would tab onto a link and activate it with the enter key. Anchors have an implicit ARIA role of link, so you don't have to bolt that on. It just comes for free. It's a link object, and it gets announced as link, wrestling. That's why it matters to put descriptive text into a link, because if you had a page full of link, click here, link, click here, link, click here, if you were a screen reader user, that would be a very hard interface to use. So if you use more descriptive text to say where the link is going to go, you'll do your users a big favor. And furthermore, the href attribute, depending on a screen reader's settings, it might actually announce the URL to the user. So it's pretty important to make use of this element because of all of these benefits that you get from it. So those are the basics of links, and now buttons are going to jump into the ring. So the mighty button element, I think it doesn't get the respect it deserves. The button element has features built in that make it a fierce competitor in the element selection process. This search button in the bottom right corner actually comes from the WWE website. WWE standing for World Wrestling Extravaganza. So what are some characteristics of buttons? What are these features that we get for free from this mighty button element? Well, they submit and reset forms. Surprise, that's what buttons were for. If they're in a button element, you can change the type, and then it will either submit a form or reset a form. There are button and input type button flavors. The advantage of the button element is that you can put children in it. You can style pseudo before and after selectors. You could nest elements inside of this button. So it does have that advantage over the input, which I've heard described as a box of spiders. So a big characteristic of buttons and why we reach for this element is that it can trigger UI changes with JavaScript. So if you're not in forms land, you're in more of an interactive JavaScript-heavy site. If you aren't navigating someone somewhere, this is a key distinction here between links and buttons. If you're not navigating, but you are relying on JavaScript, a button element is a good candidate for that. To use a button from a keyboard or a screen reader, it is reachable with the tab key, and then the space key is what will activate a button. So the link is enter, button is space. So that's a subtle distinction that we often just toss out the window because we can do whatever we want with CSS and JavaScript. But a keyboard user who is relying on the keyboard to navigate an interface, they might not get this activated on the first try based on the way the element looks. Buttons and screen readers. Like links with hrefs, buttons are focusable by default, which is awesome. We should use that more. Except rather than having an implicit role of link, the button has a role of, surprise, button. So the button would get announced as search button. For icon buttons, so I have a wrestling link here and a search button, and I have included the actual text in the button. The benefit of that is that if you have an icon button that Maybe your audience isn't familiar with your iconography. They might have cognitive accessibility, they might have a cognitive disability when they're using your application. If you put the text in the icon button, it removes any ambiguity about what it's for. So I would encourage you, if possible, to include text in your icon buttons, and the placement can move around. But at the very least, if you have an icon button and it doesn't have visible text in it, you should use some kind of a text alternative, like an ARIA label or an off-screen span. That way, someone in a screen reader, even if it's an icon button, the text will be read aloud to them. So that's a really important feature of an icon button. With button elements, here's some things that you get for free. Focusability. That is a really big one that I think people chuck the button element out the window, or maybe they don't know it exists or something, but this is something that you don't have to manage. You don't have to manage tab index. You can just keyboard tab onto this element and it will do things. It has built-in semantics, so it has that button role that gets exposed, which is actually an object in the accessibility tree. It comes with keyboard support for click event listeners, and this is a really big one. If you're doing things with JavaScript, say you're trying to shoehorn a div into being a button. It looks like a button, but it's not focusable, so you add tab index of 0 onto this div, and then you bind a click event, and you find that the click event doesn't actually fire from the keyboard because it's a div element. In contrast, the button element, it's already focusable, and it responds to click events. So this is actually less work for you. You don't have to bind a click and a key press or a key down. You can just fire a click and it will work on a button. So that's pretty cool. And it has support for disabled. You can put the disabled attribute on a button and it will remove it from the tab order and make it so that it won't submit a form, or it will prevent it from doing things. Links don't have that. You could remove an href from a link, but it's not exactly disabled. So there's some subtle distinctions here between what links are intended for and what buttons were made for. And I think buttons, I really think back to forms. That's where they originated. We do layer functionality onto them with JavaScript, so they both have their places. Some legitimate button uses. So why would you reach for a button? You might have a drop-down menu, and maybe it triggers off of one button. So you could use something like ARIA has pop-up, or a full menu pattern to have this button be the trigger for your menu. You might trigger a modal dialog, and I have an asterisk here because depending on how your modal dialog is built, if it's deep linked, you might want to use a link for that, because then if you don't have JavaScript and you can actually serve up the content in your modal dialog as a static page, then you can have some backwards compatibility. So a link might win the battle in that case. But there are plenty of modal windows that are not deep linked, that rely on JavaScript, and in that case, you could use a button to trigger a modal dialog. More commonly, you will put a button element in a modal dialog to close it, or some sort of layer where the user needs to get out of this thing. So if you use a real button element, then a keyboard or screen reader user can tab onto it, they can hit the space bar and close this item. And while we're on that subject, if you are going into that pattern, I would be sure to look up modal dialogues just to see how focus management would work, so that you're sending focus back and forth. And since the button is focusable, it's a great candidate for that because it can catch focus and things. And then lastly, media player controls are a good candidate for buttons. Things like play, pause, rewind, fast forward. Those are really reliant on JavaScript, so it's okay to use buttons for that. You probably wouldn't use links for a media player. So, win to the button. So you might be going, okay, yeah, I get it, links, buttons, whatever, but why am I here talking to you about this? Well, for some reason, I hear this a lot, but divs are easier to style. And my colleague, Paul Adam, had this tweet the other day that said, this is new, and he had seen in the wild a div with a type of button. And if you squint, you might think, well, what's wrong with that? It's just a div, it's got this attribute on it. That type doesn't do anything to a div. A div doesn't have behavior. So I think the person who had created this got a bit confused about how these attributes should be applied. So this div is just still a div. It's not a type of button. So if you find yourself falling into this, but divs are easier to style thing, start here. Here's some free CSS for you to start with. Because I have heard that is a common reason why people reach for the div element, is that they don't have to zero out all of these styles. I think you are all smart and capable, and I want to give you a little bit of a jump start. So here's a code pen. It's bit.ly/button-css. And it has some common, it's really not a lot of code to override the basic styles of a button. You could put a background color and a border and a box shadow. You could change it from the ugly default font that I have going on. And then to make it interactive for someone with a keyboard, you could put your button focus style and button hover styles right next to each other. Because often those two styles are okay, they're synonymous. If you really wanted to get fancy, you could have different states for every single one of those, but it's up to you. So here's a good place to start. So whatever you do in CSS, let this be the thing that you remember from this talk. I want you to avoid putting a blanket wildcard outline none on everything. That's really hard to walk back from that because you're zeroing out focus for everyone for every element. This is a really dangerous thing to put in your code. Even if it was in a reset style sheet or something, try and go remove it. Because then you can selectively apply focus to various patterns. If you're experimenting with focus, I would encourage you to check out CSS outline and the outline offset. So outline offset is really useful if you're doing focus management in a layout where perhaps you're sending focus to one region of a layout and it's seamless with all the elements around it. If you use outline offset, you can inset the focus ring so that it's contained inside of the element. So that one's pretty cool. And you can apply custom focus styles with focus. So this is a really valuable tool to have so that if you're trying to use a design system and you want to supply your custom focus styles, you can use custom focus on anything that's focusable. I will tell you that the default outline is more predictable. The custom focus style is going to be a bit hard to work with, but I'll give you a strategy a little bit later on for how to try and make everyone happy, because it's sort of a balancing act with focus styles. Can you take the heat? Maybe you need a more detailed set of instructions like a cookbook. There's nothing wrong with that. But getting back to an important feature of links, how many JavaScript developers do we have in the room? How about front end? Maybe you're not at the JavaScript level yet. How about design? How about QA? Do we have any QA folks? Yeah, nice. How about project managers? Everyone? Anybody else? You can raise your hand. So we're going to get into a bit of JavaScript here. This is talking about what routing and navigation, why you might choose a link, for example, over a button. So I have two variations of links here in HTML. The first one is the basic one that we've already seen, linking to an HTML resource. The second one is indicative of a client-rendered application, where JavaScript is taking that URL fragment and then figuring out what part of your application to show at that given point in time. This third version of the anchor link is the entire reason why I'm up here talking to you right now. When I audited a code base, I found this example, and my job was to say, should this be a link or a button? And I couldn't answer. I had to go digging. It's got an href of hash. It's got this tab index of 0, which is actually redundant because it's already focusable with the href. But then it had this ng-click of userpicker.userClicked. And I had to go and start digging to figure out, does that actually navigate the user somewhere? So what is navigation even? Like now that we're in these JavaScript apps where we can make JavaScript bend it to our will and have it do whatever we want, we have to kind of step back for a second and go, what is this feature of a web page? When I think of navigation, the example that immediately comes to mind for me is when I would do alley cat bike races in Seattle. And they would give you a manifest on paper with locations out of order, and you had to pick the correct order using your mind and body to arrive there as fast as you could. And the first person, it's usually first man, first woman, first fixed gear, first out-of-towner. They usually have fun prizes. But you have to do this bit of a puzzle, and it's on a city scale. And so that act of putting them in the right order and figuring out the best way to get there immediately made me think of navigation. But what about routing? I think of a mailroom where letters are being routed. You're scanning the addresses and then sending them off to various places in the globe. It's similar to routing in a web application, where you provide an address and the application will load up the appropriate context. So where does the confusion happen? Where's this falling down? Well, if we go back to my confusing Angular example, when I was asked to decide if it should be a link or button, as I mentioned, I had to go digging. I had to go into multiple layers of controllers. My clues were this ng-click of user picker, so I went and found the user picker directive. It was a component written in TypeScript. And it still, after looking at this layer of the controller, I still didn't know. I don't have an answer. Is the user clicked method redirecting the user someplace? And to give a bit of backstory, this application was a lot of layers. And it wasn't always obvious whether you were really navigating somewhere, just because there were so many. It was a very intense user interface. I actually had to ask the team. I had to ask a developer, should this be a link or a button? And he said it should be a link because it does navigate the user somewhere. So what did I take away from that is a teamwork tip. It's really confusing to debug these situations. And if you have to have your website or application audited for accessibility, they're going to fall into the same cycle of trying to answer this question. And you might fall into this cycle of answering this question. So remember that if you have other people working in your code base, it's super confusing to try and determine if something's really routing, if it's relying heavily on JavaScript click events. But more importantly, and this animated GIF is guy's getting his head smashed a little bit. It's pretty spectacular. But more importantly than the teamwork tip of making things less confusing is that links and server-side routing are a progressive enhancement strategy. So you can, instead of having JavaScript control everything, you can actually make things a bit more backwards compatible and have this backbone of links. You could have a sitemap. You could change out the way that your website or application is built under the hood and still have this link structure. So it's valuable. And I ask you to consider this persona from Joe Watkins. He says, I turn JavaScript off because it ensures my browsing experience does not have too much animation. I'm epileptic, I have low vision, and I'm very sensitive to animation and flashing. I'm also a keyboard user and a mouse user. Because of this, I turn down the brightness on my screen. I have difficulty getting around a site when they don't have focus states. Now, I never expected to be in the no JavaScript camp, and I think it is a decision that isn't going to work for every single application or website. But there's little steps that we can take to expose our web applications to people who maybe do turn JavaScript off, using server-side rendering and isomorphic JavaScript applications. One example I like a lot is React Router. And Ryan Florence, this last week, in a tweet, he said that he's had some arguments with people because the React Router link to component here only renders to anchor elements. And people really want him to change that behavior, but he cares a lot about accessibility. And so I love that React Router, they've made this a standard for how you use their router, and that's something to be proud of. Because that, as a framework consumer, that means that they're removing that confusion for you. You just use their router, and that's how it works. It creates links with hrefs. One more example of a more traditional-looking JavaScript router is from Flatiron. They have this isomorphic router called Director that I found that's pretty cool. You can use it to render your client-side routes with JavaScript, and then they have a Node.js flavor of it, I guess, that you can render the same routes on the server. So that might be a good strategy to try and get that first server-side render for someone like our persona, how he said he turned JavaScript off. You might not support every screen or every feature of your application, but at least the high-stakes things and the really valuable first landing pages that you want to give someone something, you could use an isomorphic router like this one. So really what I want you to think about after this talk is that it's all about choosing the right element for the job or the best element for the job. Sometimes it won't be an easy decision to make. You're really trying to use these elements to their full potential and make use of the web platform. because the features of both of these are inherently webby. And if we just use JavaScript on a div or a list item, we're bypassing all of the features that we could be using in these elements. It's really about craftsmanship. So taking pride in your craft and doing the most informed job that you can. Like these gentlemen who are working on boxing title belts, a lot of the important work is done behind the scenes to make a quality product that lasts. And having a good link structure is a good way to make something survive past your current application stack. Because it's really a team effort. As I'll talk about in a minute, design and development are both responsible for the end product. So if you're more on the UX side of things, this is where we're going to talk about how user experience and web accessibility go together in this decision-making process for elements. I want you to consider how a user might interact with your application. They might be using a keyboard, a touch device, their mouse, or even their voice. And so I want you to think past the way that something looks and how it actually functions. So when a user interacts with a web page, Google Drive, for example, this is more of an application. It definitely relies on JavaScript, and that's OK. But if we look at this interface, can you guess which elements are links and buttons? It's a little hard to tell. This is a very client-heavy application. So the shared with me link in the sidebar, it's actually not a link. It's not coded as either of those. But when you click on it, it redirects you. The URL changes, so it's navigating. But they haven't used either of those for this case. But it really should be a link, because when you hover or focus on it, it would show you the link in the status bar, which that's a nice feature as a user. You might not click on it if you can't see where it goes. So if you're or if you're developing a JavaScript application, that might be a good thing to reconsider if you're developing it like this guy. Here's another scenario. A bank customer who is blind calls tech support. The tech guides them through the interface saying, click on the phone button. Except it's coded as a link, which we can see here in the developer tools. The little icon button looks like a button, but it's actually coded as a link. And then it has this href of JavaScript, and it has a tab index of 0 for some reason. And so if you were the tech support trying to guide a blinded user through an interface, this would fall down. Whereas if it was a button and they said, click the phone button, it's like, should tech support and should your users know that intimately how something is made, or should they just be able to use it? So my hope is that by thinking about this, you'll apply this to your element decisions. Like when you're making these decisions of which element should I use, think about, what is the function of it? Is it actually navigating you somewhere, or is it just toggling things in an interface? Here's one more example from GitHub. So they have some interface buttons that all fit seamlessly next to each other. If we zero in on this row over here, the create new file, upload files, find file, and then the little clone or download drop-down menu thing, are these links or buttons? It's kind of hard to tell because they're all seamless, and CSS makes it look like they're all buttons. But if we open the developer tools, you can see that it's a mix of buttons and anchors. So the button is actually inside of a form, so it's making use of that form behavior. But the links next to it are not buttons. So from a user perspective, although it was very convenient to design these all next to each other, this is really separating the design from the function. And so I encourage you to think harder about that as a design person. If there's any way to group links together and group buttons together so that they can retain their original style in some way, it makes it a little less confusing to use from a keyboard perspective. Because the button will be activated with the space key and the link with the enter key. So if you're having these seamless interactions, the keyboard experience isn't quite as seamless as you would expect. So what do you do about this? This is like, we have to make these decisions all the time. So how can design set this up for success? Discuss URL changes in your design reviews. Like if you're handing off multiple screens, talk with your development team or whoever you're handing it off to, if you can, about how something will actually navigate. Like, is this a link or is this a button? It's okay to have those conversations so that you know that you're designing something with the way it should be, the function of it. You can weigh the design and the utility of these elements so that you're trying to get the most out of them and make it the least confusing you can to users. This might be an unpopular thing to say, but I think that links should look like links and buttons should look like buttons. And I know I'm going to get a lot of disagreement about that because we have CSS to smooth things over and JavaScript to smooth things over. But I encourage you to really think hard about that. And if you still end up making your links look like buttons, have good reasons. When you're handing off your designs, and this sort of goes beyond the scope of just links and buttons, it's really helpful when you're handing things off to annotate semantics so that you're not leaving so much of these decisions just up to chance. A developer just went, oh, okay, I'm just going to pick a div because no one told me that this should work a certain way. If something is supposed to be a link, you should annotate that. That can be really useful for compound widgets. Like in Nathan's talk, he had a big screen of patterns. If you had something like a tab switcher, you could actually indicate that this should be a tab panel, and you can indicate some of those semantics in your wireframes. And you can annotate interaction modes. So if you have something that's supposed to be focusable, so that it doesn't get forgotten in the development phase, you can look out for your fellow developers and helping make things more accessible just by indicating that something is focusable and what it will look like. Because often when wireframes get handed off, they have hover states and active and maybe disabled, but they probably don't have focus. So that's a really important takeaway too. If you're designing interactive user interfaces, consider how something would be usable from the keyboard and then indicate that in your wireframes or your designs. So you're probably thinking, okay, great, that's easier to do when you have this blue sky freedom to recreate something from scratch. But what if you're in a legacy site? Designs get entrenched, and you might not have that luxury of going back to fix all these old patterns. So in that case, I've been there before in my career. I would use refreshes and incremental agile stories to make improvements as you go along. As he said in the last talk, you're not going to be able to overhaul everything at once. So if you use CSS classes, you can ease that transition a little bit to get the proper code committed, and then you can apply it as you touch different parts of the code base. And I think if you have a really entrenched style guide, maybe it's worth a revision. If focus styles weren't on there and you realize it at some point, maybe it's worth it to go back and do a revision so that you can then go and add those. It's never too late to make it more accessible. But maybe the thought of going back to fix all that stuff, your face looks like this now. This girl's like grimacing and making her face, because this is not easy to do, and these aren't easy decisions. I try to make it sound exciting, but this might be you right now. That's okay. What I want you to think about is just making more educated decisions, more informed decisions about what these elements do and how you make those choices. Because I'm still learning things about elements all the time, and you can help your teammates by, as I mentioned with the routing examples, it makes it less confusing if you're using them the way they were intended. So I mentioned earlier that focus and outline can be sort of tricky to make everyone happy, and I have this video that I'm going to show of showing why that can be sort of challenging. So I have I'm clicking on elements. Some of them are custom elements, some of them are links and buttons. So first I go through Chrome. Now I'm using the keyboard to tab onto them. And then I switch over to Firefox. So you can see Firefox, when you click, it does not persist that focus style except on the divs. There's one, that's a div or a custom element. And now now this is the keyboard focus for all of these. So the difference is on elements across browsers. It kind of makes sense to me why people end up hiding the focus style for everyone, even though it's useful. It's because everyone hates these default styles. And these differences cross-browser can be really challenging. The one that I really want to key into is right now I've clicked on a div, and that focus style is persistent. That is a very difficult thing to work around when you're trying to create web components or even custom controls. When you click on a button or a link, that focus does not stay like that. And so, I've written about this pretty extensively, an article called Button Focus Hell, because that's what it felt like at the time. But how do you mitigate this? Like, How can we address this moving forward? Well, there's a tool that I've started to use that I think is definitely worth recommending. It's called whatinput, and it's a really small JavaScript library that you can pull into your HTML file. You can also require it if you have a JavaScript application or pull it in some other way. But then what it will do is give you these CSS hooks so that you can style depending on the user's input. So you can have your default focus style so that if JavaScript doesn't load, you're not zeroing out focus for everyone. You get these data attribute selectors with values of mouse, keyboard, touch, and you can be more selective about how you apply focus. Instead of just killing it for everybody, you can apply really elegant focus styles. And this smooths over this problem of how when you're clicking versus the keyboard, there's some differences there. And so I really like this solution. To try and address this from the web standard side of things, I have a few friends who are very motivated developers, and they have crafted a problem statement, a prototype really, even into this proposal for a new level 4 CSS selector of the focus ring pseudo class. Now this is really useful because it helps us solve this problem of these differences with focus and how this perceived bug of it being persistent when you click. Well, to try and fix this from the standards level, that's where focus ring comes in. So if you want to learn more about focus ring, Rob Dodson just did a really great alleycast on this, so I would recommend checking that out just to sort of set the scene of what this problem is and why they made focus ring. He walks through the polyfill that they're using, which is a bit of a requirement for now. It's a new feature. Yes, we have to load a polyfill with JavaScript so that we can try and move this forward. But it's a good time to provide feedback. If you have a better way that you think this could be done, now is the time. So we'd love to hear your input if you have ideas on how focus ring should work. Or even if we can go back and fix the original focus, that would be cool too. But I think I'll tell you in a minute why I think this is a good approach. So to use focus ring, once you have that polyfill included, and you can go and find the polyfill on github.com/wicg-focusring. or /focusring, and that's the Web Incubator community group. So when you have this polyfill installed, you then are able to use this focus ring pseudo class, and you can style it so that it's there for keyboard users, but not there for mouse users necessarily. And the trick that we've been kind of playing around with this polyfill is that you don't just zero out outline for everyone. If you wait until this polyfill is loaded, then you can zero it out, and you're providing focus ring instead. So that's an interesting way to handle it. It has been pointed out, however, that there are some mouse users who might like that focus style to persist. The problem, as you saw in the video, was that it's not standard at all. It's all over the map. It depends on the element, it depends on the browser, and so those differences are what we're trying to smooth out here. Ideally, we could let our users decide. In Android, there's a setting for force enable zoom. So we want something like that, but for focus, so that if a user does need that focus style to persist on click, they could go set it in their browser. So the user agent, with something like focus ring, we might get another crack at this so that we can actually expose a setting like this. So that's really a promising thing to pursue from the web standard side. So to be honest, the struggle is going to continue. This is not the end of it. There's lots of think pieces on links versus buttons. This is sort of a time-old challenge. But instead of battling each other, I want to encourage you to really read up on the elements that you're using so that you know how to use them to their full potential. So we can try and make more educated decisions that benefit our users. For our final smackdown, because oh yeah, we are having a smackdown, here's some takeaways that you should consider now that you've sat through my opinions about links versus buttons. Use links for navigation. Even though JavaScript can technically make routing happen on any element from a click event, divs are not focusable. They don't have a link role by default. If you use links, you can use this built-in webby feature to navigate people around. You can utilize buttons for toggling and submitting things. Those are great elements for that. Try and echo the function with the visual style. So really push back. If links look like buttons, maybe it's worth reconsidering that they should look like links. And preserve the focus styles for keyboard users. This is really critical for someone with a disability who relies on a keyboard. Less so with the screen reader, because the screen reader will possibly have an outline, or it's at least announcing things. But it is very important to preserve those focus styles, because it can be a lifeline to someone with a disability on the web. And really, it's just about making the most informed choices you can. Sometimes there's trade-offs, and it's not always an easy decision. So it's maybe a bit more gentle approach is required. But we want to make the most informed choices we can moving forward. So who wins this battle? We're all winners by promoting craftsmanship in the design and development process. Choosing the right HTML element means analyzing what features it can provide and utilizing them to their full potential rather than reinventing the wheel with JavaScript, because that is tempting sometimes. So using routing with links, for example, is a useful signifier to your teammates reading through the code base, and it has an impact on users with disabilities who rely on keyboards and screen readers to navigate the web. So that's about as many opinions that I can fit on links, buttons, routing, and navigation, and JavaScript into a 40-minute conference talk. If you have any questions that I didn't answer, maybe there's something like glaring that you want to talk about, maybe I didn't cover, I would love to hear from you on Twitter. I'm Marcy Sutton. You can also find me on GitHub and Instagram if you're so inclined. Thanks a lot to the Smashing Conf team for having me. It's been really cool to get to come and talk to you about links and buttons. And an extra special thanks to Sarah Drasner for helping me with this awesome link and button graphic. So yeah, that's it.